My name is Jennifer Hodgdon, and I am the API documentation coordinator for the Drupal Content Management System open source project, among other things. I also have a freelance business building websites in Drupal. And I'm going to talk today a little bit, it's a short talk about motivating developers to write API documentation. And I think we have a whole series of talks that were supposed to be grouped together right after lunch, but are now kind of split by lunch, but about this concept of developers and writing API documentation. And I think much of the audience is developers, so hopefully we can all relate to this. So if you have an API, so if you have a set of code that programmers need to use, you need to have documentation for it, and I think we can all agree on that. So I'm going to dispense with that whole question of whether you need API documentation and assume that we do need API documentation. So the question becomes how to get this API documentation written. And you kind of have three choices, and first one is that nobody writes the documentation, and that's obviously not very desirable because then you won't have the documentation that you need. A second possibility is you could hire technical writers to write the documentation, and that's the approach taken by Microsoft. It's probably only viable in a corporate project and probably only for a large corporation. And it may not even be desirable there because the technical writers may not know as much about as the developers do about the API that they're trying to document. And so the third possibility is to have the developers themselves, the people that are creating the API, write the documentation. And we heard the first talk of the day today talking about writing your README first. I'm talking about actually documenting the functions and the classes of the API as well, which obviously the README is a great place to start, but about making sure that all of the functions and the classes in your API are documented. So having the developers write the documentation is probably the only viable solution to get the documentation written for an open source project such as the Drupal project that I work with. And it's probably desirable for a corporate setting too. We could argue about that just because the developers are probably the ones who know the API best. They may not be the best writers, but they should know the API best. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the Drupal project, since that's what I have the most experience with. And we're working right now on Drupal version 8. When Drupal 7 came out, which was about 2 years ago now, there was a lot of improvement between Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 in the API documentation, and that was largely because there was one very motivated developer who wanted to write API documentation. That was me. So I submitted 278 patches that were mostly API documentation patches to Drupal 7. It was the number 6 patch contributor for Drupal 7, and this is not a sustainable model for how to get the API documentation written because I was not going to do the same thing again for Drupal 8. And there's only one of me, and I could get hit by a bus, and it just, obviously wasn't really viable. And similar efforts were made in the Drupal 7 cycle for usability testing. There was usability, there were 2 or 3 people, but it was really very small groups that were interested in usability, and then there was another very small group that was interested in making sure that Drupal was accessible to people with disabilities. And there was another very, very small group, maybe one person that was interested in performance. And so these things all got kind of added on after the fact, and the core developers that were working on the software weren't necessarily working on all of these areas. So none of that was sustainable. And so for the Drupal 8 cycle, when that started, the decision was made that we really need to enlist the whole community, the whole Drupal developer community in all of these efforts. And so as far as documentation goes, the main components of how that would work would be, for one thing, we had to have written standards for what good API documentation would consist of. And those are, the URL is up there on the screen. And the second thing, it's on the Drupal.org website, and there's a whole section of the Drupal.org website about our coding standards, and there's a specific page there about the API documentation standards right there. Second thing is some cultural changes had to be done, and one of them was not so much a change, it was kind of part of the culture, but it may not be part of all open source projects, so I just wanted to mention it, is that you have to have the idea in all of the developers that if the API documentation is bad, that's a bug. And it's on the same level playing field as any software bug as well. That if you have API documentation that's wrong, that doesn't match the software itself, or that doesn't give you the information that you would need, that is a bug. So that's something that I think some open source projects embrace more than others, and in the Drupal project it really has at least become accepted. And the third thing is that any kind of a patch, or you can call it a pull request or whatever you want to say, but whenever the software is going to change, if the patch doesn't have minimal API documentation updates, so if you're changing a function, you've changed the documentation. If you're adding a new function, you've added new documentation. That patch should not be acceptable. That the patch is not okay to commit to add to the repository until it has at least minimal documentation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So our fearless dictator, or whatever you want to call him, Dries, who's the head of the Drupal project, came up with this concept called core gates in Drupal. And so the idea was that instead of, like we did in Drupal 7, kind of getting to the end of the development cycle where we've added all these new features and we still have accessibility, performance, and documentation problems, that we would do more of that work up front, and we wouldn't have a huge backlog of things to do at the end of the development cycle. So the idea was that all the patches must pass through gates. So the idea is that you're not going to commit a patch until it's passed minimal standards of usability, accessibility, documentation, testing, and performance. Whether that works in practice is another question, but the idea is that if you go to drupal.org/core gates, you'll see that there are specific checklists for all 5 of these areas, and that no patch is supposed to be accepted until all 5 of those sets of criteria have been accepted, and that there are very specific things you can look at, like for documentation, if you add a new function, it's got to have a documentation header. It must at least have a 1-line description, and all of the parameters and the return value need to be documented. Real basic stuff. Doesn't have to have perfect grammar. That can be fixed later, but at least the basic information has to be there. And so, sometimes these gates are enforced, sometimes they're not, but at least we know what the standards are, and if a patch doesn't really pass the gates and gets committed, it's kind of a problem that we all recognize as a problem. And so that's at least a step in the right direction. And I don't know if other open source projects have similar concepts, but that's what we're trying to do in the Drupal project. And it's been going reasonably well, I would say, for Drupal 8. So just some specifics about the documentation gate itself. As I mentioned, all functions, classes, hooks, methods, and et cetera have to have minimal API documentation with a 1-line summary, all the parameters, the return value. And you have to be clear, but you don't have to have perfect grammar on the first pass. Another facet of that is that you have to have code comments explaining why you're doing things in your code. If you have a whole 500 lines of code and no comments in it, that's also a problem. Drupal's set up as a bunch of modules. Each module is supposed to have a description of what it does and some help text. And if you add a new module to Drupal and it doesn't have those things, that's also a failure of the documentation gate. On the issues themselves, sometimes we have issues are bug and feature request reports. So if we have an issue that has 100 comments and it doesn't have an updated summary, that's also a documentation problem. And the last thing is that when an issue gets fixed and a commit is made, if anything changes in the API or the user interface, we're supposed to have a change notice created, and if that doesn't happen, that's also a bug or a problem in the process. So that's sort of the theory. Let's talk a little bit about practicalities. I'm kind of running out of time here already. As far as just actually getting it done. So as I said, in the Drupal 7 effort, the way it got done was I wrote a bunch of patches and someone committed them. And that wasn't very viable. But one of the things that we have now is, well, for one thing, all of our API documentation is embedded in the source code with source code comments. If you're not doing that, that's just a problem, because if you have your API documentation over here on some website and your code is over here, someone's going to update the code and the website's never going to get updated. So you have to have your API documentation embedded in your code. And there's standard PHP doc, Java doc, whatever language you're working in, there's a something doc system that you can put specially formatted comments in, and they can be used to generate an API documentation site. A second thing we've done on our API documentation site, which is at api.drupal.org, on every page, which is every function or class or method documentation page you're looking at, there's a report a bug link on there, so that if somebody finds a problem in the documentation, they can click that link and it fills out a bunch of stuff for them, and they just have to explain why they saw, what problem they saw. And that's a big help, because that means that if somebody notices a problem, it's at least 50% more likely to get reported. And I don't know, I don't have statistics on that, but when we started putting that in, we started getting bug reports, and we never used to get them before. So that's a big plus, because if you don't know what the issues are, you can't really fix them. The third thing that happens is I usually triage the issues that get reported. You need to have somebody sort of doing that and managing the issue list. But if I find one that's really easy to fix, like it's a typo or the description's just a little bit wrong, I can mark it with an issue tag called novice, and then it's kind of a clue to people that are new to making patches that this is a good issue for them to work on. And it's really magic, because if I put an issue tag of novice on an issue, usually within a week there's a patch for it. So it's really great. I love it. So I don't actually do patches anymore. And the reason for that is we have this mentoring program in the Drupal project called Core Office Hours, and there's a whole group of people, and I'm not really involved in it, but they look for these novice issues, and they have a couple times a week where you can get onto IRC chat and get help in how to start contributing to the Drupal project. And they find them a novice issue, pair up the people with the issues, and mentor them through the process of setting up their Git repository and cloning it and making the patch and submitting the patch and all of that kind of stuff and getting the patch reviewed. So that's a great thing too, because if I mark it novice, then there's these other team of people that can help the novice patchers actually make the patches. And then the last thing is that we have a dedicated person who reviews API documentation patches. That's me. And I'm also empowered to commit the changes to the Drupal repository. So we have only 6 core committers right now in the Drupal project. And I can technically could commit anything, but I don't. I'm only allowed to commit documentation patches and code cleanups and things like that. So having somebody who's dedicated to just fixing API docs kind of frees up the other core committers, so they don't think it's a waste of time. I mean, they don't anyway, but it just frees them up to work on making sure that the code changes are good. And I can do these documentation changes because they're not controversial. I can look at the code, look at the documentation. Does it match? Good, I'll commit it. And if it doesn't, I won't commit it. So that really speeds up the process. And for the novices, it's really good feedback, because usually within a week of them submitting an issue, I will have it committed or else sent back for more for changes. So that way they can, rather than sitting around and waiting for months for something to get reviewed, they can get pretty good feedback, and then they're more likely to come back and contribute some more once they see how easy it is, hopefully. So that's all I actually had to say, I guess. Oh, that's the end of my presentation. So anyway, just some ideas of what we're doing in the Drupal project on how to get the documentation written. Thanks.
Okay, questions? Oh, yep.
Hi. I work with a community where we need to have developers participating in writing the documentation. And one thing I hear from people, even people who to me seem to have pretty good writing skills, is they're very insecure about it. And how do you help people in the community feel more secure about their writing skills, get better grammar skills, so on and so forth?
So it's kind of interesting. The Drupal community is truly international, and a large fraction of the people that contribute documentation patches, English is not even their native language. And so we have a lot of that coming in, and people will submit a patch and worry about whether they got the grammar right, or they'll maybe be a little bit worried about it. The way I usually approach it is, first of all, when I review a patch, I always say, great, thanks first, and then talk about the things that maybe could be better. The other thing is, in the API documentation, again, we don't necessarily need all of the grammar to be absolutely perfect. And the third thing is, I will offer concrete suggestions, especially if I think somebody's probably not a native speaker. I will say, hey, great. As a native speaker, I think a better wording would be this, and just try to be really constructive about it and not make it a big, huge problem, and just kind of try to help people get pushed in a better direction. So I don't know if any of those things are perfect solutions, but we do work in the Drupal community with people who have a wide-ranging skills in English, and some of them because it's not their native, many of them because it's not their native language. And I think just trying to be encouraging and just help people, guide people in the right direction, and not get on people's cases for not being able to write. And that just encouraging people, please make the patch anyway, at least the documentation will be better than it was. Yeah. And not trying for that complete perfection.
So there's a tension between API docs that are auto-generated and writing them by hand. Automated tools generally create a sort of flat list of classes or functions sort of alphabetically. And the function that comes first is usually not that interesting. And if you were explaining the system to someone, you might say, well, persistent class is the heart of it, and there are these other associated classes. So do you have any good solutions to that tension?
The documentation system that we use, which is based, I think most automated documentation systems have this, but you can actually make topic pages. So they're separate from individual class and function documentations. We have probably, I think we have about somewhere between 50 and 75 topics right now for each version of Drupal. So for instance, you can have a topic about text cleansing functions, and you can write a description of what they do, you can point out a couple functions, and then just list those functions, and then you're down to a list of maybe 20 or 30 versus trying to search the documentation for a text cleansing function. So that's one way to make the organization more manageable, because the Drupal API has, I think I did a query, and we have something like 30,000 individual documentation items between classes, methods, functions, properties, all of those kinds of things. And there's no way somebody can find something that is useful to them that way. And so having these topics gives you the ability to highlight certain things that people need to know. And then we also do have online documentation that is separate from the API documentation. So the tutorials, the how to write a new module, the best programming practices for security. And those are just separate from the API documentation and will mention specific functions that you should be using, but they aren't the API documentation themselves. So I think you have to have guideposts or topic pages or separate documentation to help people find stuff, because the API documentation site's really a reference. So I know I need to use this function. What are the parameters? That kind of thing.
Next question. Oh, okay.
Yep. Oh, got to get the mic.
Do you have any suggestions about, and I know a lot of writers have been in this situation sometimes in their careers, where you don't have a culture of documentation and it's not being enforced by management, and so you'll get kind of this attitude from developers of, well, comments and code, that's not my business. Specking, not my business. That's not my job. And then that's kind of either reinforced or it's allowed to perpetuate itself by engineering management.
Yeah.
So you have, like, from the top down and the bottom up, this entire culture of, well, that's somebody else's problem. We have one writer. They should be taking care of everything. Right.
I used to work in, right now a lot of the documentation work I'm doing is with the Drupal open source project, but I have had real jobs before. I'm a freelancer now, but I've had real jobs before in software companies, and I know what you're talking about. So I have a couple comments on that. And the first thing is there is very little way that, even the developers need good API documentation, right? Because if you're in a big company, in a project with 10 or more developers, or even hundreds of developers, and you are writing a small piece of code, you're going to be using API functions that someone else wrote. And if you don't have good documentation on what those functions do and what the parameters are, what the return value is, you're going to have to go and read the code every single time, which is not the most productive use of your time. So, I would say, but it does have to be a cultural thing. You've got to get that idea into the heads of the developers all the way up to the management, because it's very important. And somebody I was talking to yesterday at the meet and greet pre-registration thing was talking to me about everybody uses IDEs these days. Well, if you put that API documentation in the IDE, in the code, with the special source code comments that they're fairly standard, at param and at return and all of that stuff, your IDE is going to give you that information when you hover over a function or when you start typing it. So it's a big benefit to IDE users too. And the third reason I think you can give to try to start changing the culture is maintenance. In other words, you're going to end up maintaining somebody's code, and they wrote the code 5 years ago, and they're not at the company anymore, and someone's going to end up maintaining your code down the road. And if management's not worried about maintenance, they're not thinking long term at all. So I don't think you can really maintain code without the documentation, because how do you even know if it breaks? If it's broken. Well, if you change the way it works from what it was, but you don't have documentation of how it was supposed to have been working, how do you even know which one is right? So, to me, like having the documentation plus the in-code comments it's going to make maintenance possible. I mean, I wouldn't even say easy, I would say possible. So I think there are a lot of really good reasons to need documentation to be there, and it doesn't have to be extensive. It doesn't have to be like writing an essay every time you have a function, but just a one-line description and what the parameters and what the return value is just something that everybody's going to need.
So it sounds like maybe articulating to the rest of your organization
why it's important, right?
why it's in their interest.
Right. And I think, if you have developers that haven't worked in large companies before, younger developers, or just people that haven't worked in software that's evolved over time and has existed for a long period of time, they may not be aware of why they need the documentation. So I think you do have to educate them.
Questions upstairs? I see some people waving hands way up there, so I'm going to run over there. Okay. I can hear you.
All right. So I have a question about user-facing documentation in the context of Drupal. And I've been writing a lot of Drupal documentation for these end users, and I want to contribute to the Drupal documentation as a whole, but I'm not sure where the user-facing stuff fits into the bigger picture. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the question is about, I don't know if everybody downstairs could hear, but the question is about the user-facing documentation as opposed to the API documentation and how that fits into the big picture and how people can contribute to that. So I used to be the coordinator for the documentation group as a whole, and I resigned that position because the user-facing documentation was a big pile of spaghetti and I couldn't deal with it. Because it was kind of a wiki, more or less, whatever. In some broad definition of wiki, it was a wiki. And basically anybody could add a page at any time, and it just becomes kind of this mess. So in an open source project, that's always a problem, I think. In an open source project that doesn't have a company behind it, at least, it's always going to be a problem to get that user-facing documentation written. And I don't think that developers are good at writing user-facing documentation. We're not even good at designing good user interfaces, for heaven's sakes. So don't ask the developers to write the detailed end user documentation, because we already know how to use the thing because we built it, right? So that's not going to work. I think you have to, in an open source project like the size of Drupal, you have to start building a group of people that don't have coding skills but want to contribute to the project and have writing skills. And that was what the documentation coordinator was supposed to do, and I kind of failed at that because I'm kind of a developer and maybe not a people wrangler. But we have a new documentation coordinator now. Let's talk later. But I don't really have a good answer for how to get the user-facing documentation done. But don't expect the developers to write it, because they won't ever write any code if they have to write the user documentation for it. You need to have a separate group of people, and you need to have good tools for them to use, and you need to have a way for that to have some editorial control as well. And we're kind of I'm working with the current documentation coordinator on some tools right now, but they're not there. So, yep.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Okay. The developers are probably the ones who know the API best. They may not be the best writers, but they should know the API best. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the Drupal project, since that's what I have the most experience with. And we're working right now on Drupal version 8. When Drupal 7 came out, which was about 2 years ago now, there was a lot of improvement between Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 in the API documentation, and that was largely because there was one very motivated developer who wanted to write API documentation. That was me, the documentation that you need. A second possibility is you could hire technical writers to write the documentation, and that's the approach taken by Microsoft. It's probably only viable in a corporate project and probably only for a large corporation. And it may not even be desirable there, because the technical writers may not know as much about as the developers do about the API that they're trying to document. And so the third possibility is to have the developers themselves, the people that are creating the API, write the documentation. And we heard the first talk of the day today talking about writing your README first. I'm talking about actually documenting the functions and the classes of the API as well, which obviously the README is a great place to start, but about making sure that all of the functions and the classes in your API are documented. So having the developers write the documentation is probably the only viable solution to get the documentation written for an open source project such as the Drupal project that I work with. And it's probably desirable for a corporate setting too. We could argue about that just because my name is Jennifer Hodgdon, and I am the API documentation coordinator for the Drupal Content Management System open source project, among other things. I also have a freelance business building websites in Drupal. And I'm going to talk today a little bit, it's a short talk about motivating developers to write API documentation. And I think we have a whole series of talks that were supposed to be grouped together right after lunch, but are now kind of split by lunch, but about this concept of developers and writing API documentation. And I think much of the audience is developers, so hopefully we can all relate to this. So if you have an API, so if you have a set of code that programmers need to use, you need to have documentation for it, and I think we can all agree on that. So I'm going to dispense with that whole question of whether you need API documentation and assume that we do need API documentation. So the question becomes how to get this API documentation written. And you kind of have three choices, and first one is that nobody writes the documentation, and that's obviously not very desirable because then you won't have